Muammar Gaddafi rose as a revolutionary who promised freedom and defiance against the West. But behind the image of strength, he hid terrible secrets at home. Young women were taken from their schools, families shattered, and whole communities silenced under his rule. Muammar Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a desert tent near Sirte, Libya. His family was poor, belonging to the Gaddafi tribe. From a young age, he grew up hearing stories about foreign powers ruling Libya. First the Italians, then the British. These stories shaped his anger and ambition. In 1969, when he was only 27, Gaddafi and a group of young officers overthrew King Idris in a coup. He promised freedom, equality, and a better life for Libyans. People celebrated. They thought he was a savior. But behind the promises, Gaddafi was building a dictatorship. He created a secret police, silenced anyone who spoke against him, and used fear to control the country. At first, the world only saw his politics. Nobody knew yet what he was doing to women behind closed doors. In the late 1970s, he shocked an outside world by creating a unit of women bodyguards. He called them the Amazonian Guard. Newspapers and television channels across the world showed photos of these women in military uniforms, walking proudly beside him. To outsiders, it looked like he was giving women power in a society where men usually held control. He even told people that women were safer in his protection than anywhere else. But behind this public show, the truth was very different. Most of these women were not volunteers at all. Many were teenagers who had no choice in the matter. Gaddafi's men went into villages and sometimes even family homes to take young girls away. Parents were pressured into agreeing. If they refused, they risked losing their jobs, homes, or even their safety. Some families were tricked into believing their daughters were being offered an important national duty. They were told it was an honor. But once the girls were gone, families often never saw them again. The training camps were hidden from the public. From the outside, it seemed like a normal military program. The girls were taught how to shoot rifles, march in formation, and act like soldiers. They wore uniforms and practiced drills. But the real purpose of these camps was far darker. Survivors later explained that Gaddafi used the camps to break them down. They were forced to obey strict rules, cut ties with their families, and become completely loyal to him. Many of the girls were assaulted during training. Gaddafi would pick out the ones he wanted and force them into his private quarters. For him, this was not only about physical desire, but also about control. He enjoyed having complete power over them, knowing they could not say no. The image of female guards standing beside him in public was a mask. It made him look modern and progressive, while in reality, it was a cover for abuse. What made this even more disturbing was how carefully it was staged. Whenever Gaddafi traveled abroad, he brought the female guards with him. Leaders and journalists from other countries saw them as a sign of his so-called revolutionary spirit. But none of them knew, or perhaps wanted to know, that these women were suffering behind closed doors. The guards became both a political tool and a personal harem, serving his image on the outside and his desires in secret. For the young women trapped in this system, life was a nightmare. By the 1980s, Gaddafi tightened his grip on women by creating another disturbing group he called the Revolutionary Nuns. On the surface, these women looked like symbols of loyalty and strength. They wore matching uniforms, stood in neat lines during his speeches, and were presented as proof that women were central to his revolution. To the outside world, it looked like he was pushing for equality. But in reality, it was another mask for something much darker. Many of the girls chosen were still teenagers, some only 15 or 16. families often had no say. They were summoned directly to his compound in Bab al-Azizia, the heavily guarded fortress in Tripoli where Gaddafi lived. Once inside, the girls quickly realized the truth. Their rule was not about serving the revolution, but serving Gaddafi himself. The rules inside Bab al-Azizia were cruel and absolute. Whatever Gaddafi wanted, they were forced to give. If a girl resisted or cried out, she faced beatings, humiliation, or worse punishments that left her too scared to ever fight back again. Deep beneath the compound, Gaddafi had built underground rooms. These spaces were hidden from the outside world, locked and heavily guarded. Survivors later described them as prisons where light barely reached. Girls were kept there for days or even months, completely cut off from their families. Once a girl was chosen for him, her old life was over. She no longer had control over her own future. Guards and officials around Gaddafi knew exactly what was happening. They helped bring the girls in, watched over them, and made sure no one escaped. But everyone was too afraid to challenge him, so the abuse continued unchecked. By the 1990s, Gaddafi's crimes against women reached an even more disturbing level. He no longer waited for his guards or officials to bring young women to him. Instead, he turned schools and universities across Libya into his own hunting grounds. Education, which should have been a safe space for children and young adults, became one of the most dangerous places for girls to be. Teachers and principals were forced to take part in this system. They were told to identify the prettiest and most promising students and report their names to Gaddafi's men. If they refused, they risked losing their positions or, worse, being punished themselves. This meant that schools were no longer just about learning. They became traps where a girl's future could be stolen overnight. Some of the girls chosen were barely teenagers. They were told they were being honored, that they had been selected to meet the leader, or that they would be given scholarships and opportunities. For many families living in poverty, it sounded like a chance for their daughters to have a better life. But once the girls entered Gaddafi's compound, the truth was revealed. Families who resisted faced terrible pressure. In Libya under Gaddafi, saying no was dangerous. Parents who tried to protect their daughters could lose their jobs, their land, or even be jailed. Some families were watched closely by security forces, making it impossible to hide their children. Fear spread through entire communities, and parents lived in constant worry that their daughters might be taken at any time. Inside the compound, the reality was horrifying. The girls who were brought in were stripped of their innocence. Many were assaulted on their very first day. Some were kept for days, others for years. Those who were released were often given small sums of money, clothes, or gold jewelry, as if these items could erase what had been done to them. For Gaddafi, these gifts were just another way of showing his power, reducing human lives to something that could be bought. For those kept in the compound, escape was nearly impossible. Guards patrolled every corner, and the underground rooms were locked tight. The girls lived under constant fear, knowing that every day could bring new torment. Even when they weren't directly in Gaddafi's presence, they were reminded that he controlled their fate. Gaddafi's abuse was not limited to his main fortress in Tripoli. To make his crimes easier to hide, he built or took control of secret apartments and houses in different cities across Libya. These places looked ordinary from the outside, but inside, they were prisons. In Tripoli, Benghazi, and his hometown of Sirte, whole buildings were dedicated to holding women who had been taken. Only Gaddafi's trusted men had access, and neighbors usually had no idea what was happening inside. Officials who later defected from his regime admitted that these apartments were always stocked with young women. Some were Libyan girls taken from schools, villages, or even hospitals. Others were foreigners who had been tricked into coming to Libya with promises of work or education. Once inside the country, they had no escape. Their passports were taken away immediately, cutting off any chance of going back home. Foreign women were often targeted during Gaddafi's official trips abroad. His men would scan crowds or events, looking for attractive models, nurses, or students. They would approach these women with offers that sounded exciting, including good jobs, scholarships, or financial help. Some women thought they were being given a once-in-a-lifetime chance. But when they arrived in Libya, the truth became clear. European women were not safe either. Some were lured from countries like Italy, France, and the Balkans, especially during the 1980s and 1990s, when Libya was trying to build closer ties with parts of Europe. Many thought they were coming for diplomatic work or education, but soon they realized they were trapped. Women from Africa were targeted even more. Libya under Gaddafi saw itself as the leader of Africa, and he poured money into projects across the continent. This gave him easy access to young women from poorer nations such as Chad, Sudan, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. Many of them believed they were traveling to Libya for jobs as maids, secretaries, or students. Instead, they ended up in the secret apartments, powerless and far from their families. Conditions inside these apartments were harsh. The women were under constant watch with guards at the doors. They could not contact the outside world. Some were moved around from one apartment to another so that nobody could track them. Even if rumors spread, there was never clear proof because the locations were kept secret. Another disturbing part of Gaddafi's system was how he used hospitals for his own desires. He always kept a team of personal nurses around him, and many of them were from Eastern Europe, especially from Ukraine, Serbia, and other parts of the former Soviet Union. On the outside, these women looked like respected professionals, always standing near him during foreign visits or medical checkups. The world saw them as loyal staff who were there to take care of his health. But behind the scenes, their lives were very different. Some of these nurses were pressured into having sexual relationships with him. Refusing was not an option. It didn't stop there. Nurses and hospital staff were also forced to help him find new victims. In some cases, young women who came to hospitals for regular treatment or checkups were noticed by doctors or nurses and then reported to Gaddafi's men. These women were later taken to his compounds, often under the false claim that he wanted to support them financially or provide them with better medical care. But once inside, it was the same exploitation. This corruption of medical spaces shows how far his control went. Nothing was safe from his reach. Gaddafi's cruelty was not limited to free women. Female prisoners, especially those accused of political crimes, suffered terribly. In Abu Salim prison, the most feared jail in Libya, women were locked away in dirty, overcrowded cells. The conditions were brutal. Food was scarce, water was limited, and medical care was almost non-existent. Many of them grew sick, but their suffering was ignored. Inside these walls, women faced far worse than just hunger and disease. Guards often assaulted them, sometimes acting on Gaddafi's direct orders. What made this even more tragic was who these women were. Many of them were highly educated. They were teachers who had once stood in classrooms, lawyers who had tried to defend justice, and activists who had spoke out for basic rights. Their crime was having a voice in a country where Gaddafi allowed no opposition. What happened to these women did not only affect them, it broke entire families apart. In Libya's conservative society, sexual abuse was not spoken about openly. Instead of being seen as victims, many women were unfairly blamed for what was done to them. When they were finally released or managed to escape, they returned to homes that no longer felt safe. Some fathers and brothers reacted with anger, not at Gaddafi, but at the women themselves. There were cases where young women were killed by their own families in so-called honor killings, because relatives believed their family's name had been stained. Others were quietly sent away to distant relatives, hidden from neighbors, so no one would know what had happened. Even in families that did not reject them, silence ruled. Survivors were rarely allowed to speak about what they had suffered. Mothers told daughters to bury their memories, and communities pretended nothing had happened. This silence only deepened the pain. For many women, the abuse followed them for the rest of their lives. Some never married because society would not accept them. Others lived in poverty after being cast out by their families. A few fled Libya altogether, trying to start new lives in foreign countries where no one knew their past. By the early 2000s, Gaddafi was desperate to fix his image abroad. He had ruled for decades, and the world had grown tired of his reputation as a dangerous dictator. To soften his image, he gave up Libya's nuclear weapons program in 2003, paid compensation for past terrorist attacks linked to his regime, and opened the country to Western oil companies. Leaders from Europe, Africa, and even the United States began shaking his hand. He was welcomed into the African Union as a symbol of unity, and in 2009, he even stood before the United Nations in New York. But all of this was only a mask, and nothing had changed. His iron grip on society remained as tight as ever, and his abuse of women continued. The same schools where young girls were supposed to learn still carried the shadow of his men, who could appear at any time to select students. Hospitals were still places of fear for many women. Nurses whispered warnings, but no one could stop it. His main compound, Bab el-Azizia in Tripoli, still held women against their will. Some had been there for weeks, others for years. Even as he smiled for cameras and tried to charm the outside world, his actions at home were tearing lives apart. It was a double life. The statesman shaking hands abroad, and the predator continuing his abuses in secret. The contrast planted seeds of rage in Libyan society, which would erupt soon. And when it did, Gaddafi's carefully built image would collapse in flames. By 2011, the Arab Spring had already swept across Tunisia and Egypt, bringing down long-standing leaders. When protests reached Libya, they began as small demonstrations for reform. But in a country where people had suffered under fear for more than 40 years, those protests quickly turned into a full-scale revolution. For the first time, women who had suffered in silence began to speak out. They told rebels and journalists about the horrors hidden in Gaddafi's compounds. Their voices revealed a side of the dictatorship the world had ignored for too long. Rebel fighters who stormed Bab al-Azizia found hidden rooms filled with evidence of crimes. There were mattresses stained with blood, underground cells, and drugs used to sedate women. Some of the women who managed to escape were in terrible condition, weak from years of abuse. Doctors treating survivors reported shocking details. Some women had been forced into abortions after being made pregnant by soldiers or by Gaddafi himself. Others were deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases as a form of punishment, ensuring their futures were ruined, even if they managed to escape alive. The truth shocked even Libyans who thought they already knew Gaddafi's cruelty. It was worse than anyone imagined. In October 2011, after months of fighting, Gaddafi's rule finally collapsed. NATO airstrikes had weakened his forces, and rebels had pushed him out of Tripoli. He fled east towards his hometown of Sirte, trying to make a last stand. But the city was surrounded and he had nowhere left to run. On October 20th, Gaddafi's convoy was attacked as he attempted to escape. Rebel fighters captured him, hiding in a drainage pipe. Minutes later, he was beaten and killed on the spot. News of his death spread across Libya and around the world within hours. Crowds poured into the streets, celebrating the fall of a man who had ruled with terror for more than 40 years. For many Libyans, it felt like the end of a nightmare. But for the women who had suffered under him, his death brought mixed emotions. On one hand, the dictator who had destroyed their lives was finally gone. Yet the scars left behind could not disappear overnight. Some had lost families. Others carried children born from abuse. Many could not speak openly, even after his fall, because the shame in society remained heavy. Justice was never truly served. Most of the men who helped Gaddafi carry out these crimes blended back into society. Few were held accountable. Today, Libya is still unstable, torn apart by conflict. For the women who lived through Gaddafi's rule, healing has been slow. Some organizations have tried to support survivors, but the wounds run deep.